Empire, Racism, and Genocide: A History of U.S. Foreign Policy. I've read the book.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and maybe we'll kind of in this part of the interview, maybe we'll just touch on some of the points that you're making in this book.
Okay.
And I mean, it's a very good title. It really, you know what you're picking up when you pick it up
Right.
off the bookshelf, right? And when you look at the contents, there's part 1, part 2, and basically part 3,
Mm-hmm.
and there's a part 4, but that's a conclusion.
Right.
Part 1, it's titled Manifest Destiny, that covers the years 1750 to 1898, and it talks about different portions of history, like the Native Americans, the War of 1812, the Mexican-American War, the Spanish-American War, all of that time frame. Part 2 it covers years 1899 to 1953. That part is titled A New World Power. It covers the World War I and World War II, the Korean War. And then part 3 is 1954 to the present, and it's titled Fighting Invented Enemies, and that goes right from Vietnam to the present day.
Yes.
And you suggest that really it's been about the same throughout the entire
Mm-hmm.
history of the United States. It's been like this. Now explain what this is. What are you explaining here over the course of all of the history of the United States? What's going on?
What's going on is that the United States, since its inception, has used public relations to attempt to convince the citizenry, and very successfully, that it's a democracy that wants only to bring democratic principles and governments to other nations, that it will assist any other nation that wants to foster democracy and to improve the democracy, and and those are wonderful goals. However, the truth of the matter is that the United States is, and from its earliest years, has been an imperial power, has colonies around the world. There are hundreds and hundreds of military bases in different countries, but also countries that democratically elect their governments, that international watch organizations, Amnesty International and others, observe the elections and say they are truly democratic. If that new president in that country is too far to the left, then the United States has a history of destabilizing that country or invading and overthrowing that country because it does not follow what the United States wants. And often what the United States wants is favorable trade agreements, access to trade routes,
Mm-hmm.
or the natural resources of that country that the country isn't necessarily willing to surrender to the United States. So it's from the beginning, it's been about power and money, and any idea of the basic human rights of the people that get in the way are just dismissed.
Okay, so what I want you to do is just take one example from each of the 3 general time periods. Yeah, you may.
Yeah, okay.
You may refer to your own book. So, like what you said, where they topple a government because it wasn't in the interest of the United States, and they either invaded or they put someone else in power. So, let's start with the first, somewhere in that first time frame. What happened? What was the situation?
Okay.
What did the United States do? And then we'll move on to the next after that.
Okay, let's look at the Spanish-American War.
Okay, give us a background on it.
Okay, at that time, Spain or Cuba was a colony of Spain, and the Cuban people were anxious to gain their independence. And Spain, of course, as any colonial or any empire, didn't want to give that up. So the United States was pushing for that because Cuba had a number of there were a lot of business interests that Americans had in Cuba at that time. So Teddy Roosevelt was the Secretary of Defense. He later became president. And he was very anxious for the United States to become a world naval power. He wanted it to be very, very powerful. So what the United States did was they sent a battleship called the Maine to, I think it was Havana Harbor, just as a show of strength. After it was there for just a number of weeks, the ship exploded. Now, there were a number of reasons why it may have exploded, but what Mr. Roosevelt said he said it was sabotage, that it was Spain had blown up the Maine, killed a couple of hundred soldiers, and that this was an act of war, and he soon after declared war. Now, the interesting thing about it was that...
What year was this, roughly?
This was 1898.
Okay.
So there were once the ship exploded, there were several experts who came forward and said they would like to be involved in the investigation to find out what had happened. And one of them had publicly said a few days after the explosion that it seemed to be not a mishandling of the cargo, but an explosion of the cargo from inside the ship. And he had reasons why it looked like that. He said that there's never been an explosion from outside of a ship that has caused this kind of a damage, this kind of hole in the ship. It wasn't known. His expertise was not invited. Another gentleman who was also an expert in ordnance and this sort of thing was not invited. So a very quick investigation was held. It was determined that it was sabotage, and war was declared. Now, interestingly, in the 1970s, 90 years after this happened, about 80 years, an investigation was done, and there was no evidence from all the records that were kept, that were explored. There was no record that it was anything other than something internal to the ship that had gone wrong. So this was a situation that was manufactured to start a war that would give the United States naval power, would be able to exert its power and show the world that the U.S. was flexing its muscle, and it had muscle to flex.
Is this what you would call a false flag?
Well,
like it's an engineered, it wasn't an enemy that blew up the ship. It was done within, it was engineered that way to make it look like it was an enemy.
I think it was an accident. It was an accident that occurred on the ship, something to do with the fuel and the cargo.
Okay.
And it blew up.
So they had this disaster,
mm-hmm.
and they jumped at the opportunity. They saw an opportunity, took it.
Yes.
Okay.
And before we go into the second era, I want to jump to the third for something that's closely parallel, and that's Vietnam.
Okay.
Now, just a little background on that. Vietnam was a colony of France, and the United States was doing a little bit financially and sending advisors to help France hold on to the colony. But then finally France decided they couldn't handle it anymore. So the United States sent advisors and started to send send soldiers to fight the Vietnamese. And
this is to help France?
France at this point left. But now...
Who's this helping?
Well, it's preventing the reunification of Vietnam under a communist government. So Vietnam was partitioned between the North and the South. The North was under a communist government. The South was under a U.S. puppet government. So what was the U.S.'s interest in the Vietnam? Or I remember reading in your book, there really was no advantage to, it wasn't like they didn't have resources, they didn't have anything there. Why were they there? Why did they care so much? Because during the early 1950s, McCarthyism was rampant. This was Senator Joseph McCarthy was accusing everybody in the State Department and in different governmental areas of being a member of the Communist Party. So there was a great fear of communism at that time. It was just there was a communist under every bed, and that lasted at least through the 60s and beyond. Mm-hmm. So when no president ever wanted to be accused of allowing a country to fall to communism, as I said. So with France leaving, no longer maintaining the status quo in Vietnam, then the choice was for the United States to keep South Vietnam ostensibly free, although it wasn't free actually, to prevent it from reuniting with the communist North. So that was the reason. It wasn't there was no strategic value to it, but the United States couldn't let a country become communist.
So it was more about showing the world that we're not going to let communism take over any country.
Yes, there was the domino theory, or the theory of the domino effect, that if one country fell to communism, others around it would, and that would. I don't know why people don't ask, well, why do these countries want to become communist? What do they have that they don't have today? So, but that's a question that's seldom asked. So that was why the United States decided to intervene. So there were a number of soldiers in Vietnam at that time, maybe about 20,000, when an incident occurred in the Gulf of Tonkin, which is off the coast of Vietnam.
Mm-hmm.
A ship called the Sea Turner Joy was, the instrument panel indicated that it was under attack. So the United States responded with firepower, and then the captain the next day said that it appeared that was an error in the instrumentation, that there had been no attack. However, the U.S. Congress used this event to pass a resolution, the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which gave President Johnson the right to escalate the war as much as he wanted to, in defense of, to prevent this aggression against the United States. There had been no aggression against the United States. The captain of the ship said there wasn't really an attack. It was, I don't know about naval instruments, but whatever it was, he said it was a false reading.
Right, might have been a bird or something like that. Or
whatever. Yeah, I don't know, something.
Okay.
So, but regardless of that, the U.S. Congress, not wanting to be soft on communism.
So no one got killed or anything?
No one got killed.
A ship didn't blow up. It's just, it sensed that it was being attacked, and
Right.
then they realized that, that was just a false alarm.
Mm-hmm. But that was used as an example
Maybe
of
it was
aggression.
fireworks.
Maybe. Yeah, that could have been it.
I don't know if the listeners can hear this, but like this is being recorded 2 days before Victoria Day, and right outside the house there's some fireworks going off. So
Yes.
maybe someone was playing with fireworks and it set off the instruments or something.
It might have been. So, but the captain said that his observation at the time, he saw a lot of U.S. firepower, but didn't see any enemy ships. And then the
So U.S. firepower?
Yeah, responding to.
Okay, someone was firing at something.
Well, he had reported that he was being fired on, so U.S. Airplanes came to shoot at whatever was there. Well, there was nothing there to shoot at, but he said it was an impressive display of firepower. Anyway, so the Congress, the Senate, and House of Representatives passed a resolution. The president signed it, and within less than a year, the number of soldiers in Vietnam went from 24,000 to over 200,000. So the draft was...
So they were just waiting for an opportunity.
Just waiting for an opportunity.
Okay.
And of course the war dragged on for years, and ultimately the U.S. left, and South Vietnam was reunited with North Vietnam under a communist government. And
okay.
Yeah.
All right, so that's
it's two periods.
All right, that's the first period and the third period.
Right.
Second period. That's World War I, World War II, Korean War era.
I wanted to I just wanted to go into Vietnam because the parallel to the situation with the Maine and the Spanish-American War was so clear. I thought it was a made-up situation.
Kind of like they were just sitting waiting for an opportunity to show itself.
For a reason.
Once it does, they were ready to move.
Yeah.
It looked like.
Okay. I'm going to talk about World War I, although I do want to get into World War II a little bit. But in World War I, President McKinley said that for a long time that there was no way the United States would enter that war. However, there were a variety of businesses that were pushing him to enter that war. So ultimately he did. And of course the war killed millions of people. And towards the end of the war, even President McKinley, who had declared war, said this. He said, "Is there any man here, let me repeat, is there any man, woman, or child here who does not know this was a commercial and industrial war?" So this is the President of the United States admitting he was totally, apparently at this point, disillusioned, but he saw the war for what it was.
Wow. And I want to ask you about World War I. And I read in other parts of your book that many times there's many countries involved, but really it's like 90% of the soldiers are U.S. and the 10% are all the other nations that make up the army.
Yes.
Right. Was it like that for World War One?
It wasn't quite as dramatic percentage of U.S. soldiers, but it was mostly U.S. soldiers.
Mostly, yeah. I know Canadians were involved. That's a war that
Yeah.
Canada was involved
Mhm.
with. My grandfather was in World War One.
Oh. Mhm.
He and he even lied about his age to get into the
Oh,
he was too young. He was 15.
Oh,
I
that's
think
so
you're
young.
Supposed to be 50. You're supposed to be 16
Yeah.
at least, right?
Well,
And he was sent off. And he was also in World War II, like when he was older.
okay.
So
Yeah.
he was in two wars, like
Yeah.
that's, and these are these are not Canadian wars. These are
Right.
like I don't know how, I don't know all the history behind it, but these are. Is this the U.S. leading the world in war? Is this?
Yes.
Do you see it that way?
The U.S. Well, first of all, the U.S. gives a lot of money to other countries in foreign aid and trade and so on. So that encourages them to toe the U.S. line.
It-
Certainly.
What's the? Okay, in a nutshell, just to remind, like for younger generation listeners that don't know
Mhm.
anything about history.
Mhm.
What is the narrative, the general narrative that's taught about what the reason why World War One happened, and then tell us the real reason why it happened?
Well, the general narrative was that there were people's freedoms in various countries were being denied, and the United States needed to. The United States built itself as this beacon of freedom and democracy, and in that role had an obligation to help people in these countries.
Which countries were they involved initially? There was only like somebody got assassinated, and
Yeah.
like what happened?
Yeah,
Which country was this?
That was Austria. The British passenger ship Lusitania was sunk by the Germans
Okay.
in 1915, and that outraged Americans. Germany and England were at war, and Germany had warned the U.S. that British ships would be sunk, and that U.S. passengers should not sail on them.
Yes, I remember that part. I remember that part of the book. Yeah. So
Now-
Germany. So wait. So this is Germany saying.
Say-
Wait. Who's saying? Say it again. Germany is warning.
the U.S.
Okay.
that it's going to be sinking British boats and British ships, and advising the U.S. to tell its citizens not to sail on British ships.
So this is this at a time where Germany is sort of allies with the United States, or like why would they give them a forewarning? Is that
There was some allies, but they also didn't want to anger the United States tremendously.
Oh,
They-
okay.
They were involved in a war with England, and
Okay, they wanted to
wanted to keep
not
it out of
ruffle the
there.
wrong feathers.
Yes, that's a good way of putting it.
Okay, I understand.
So, and what Germany claimed was that the Lusitania was carrying munitions to England, and it turned out that was true, that there were passengers on it also, but it was also carrying munitions. So Germany torpedoed it and sunk it, and thousands of people. I don't remember how many people were killed exactly, but during in early 1917, well, Lusitania was the most famous one in 1915, but about 6 other ships were sunk at that time. They were either owned by U.S. citizens or carrying U.S. citizens. I said President McKinley before. That was I misspoke. That was President Wilson.
President Wilson.
President
Okay.
Wilson.
Okay.
He said that they were going to remain neutral, and does not intend to become involved in war. But the business community was getting nervous. Can I read a short quote?
Sure. Yes. Yes. Please.
U.S. entry into World War I was closely bound up with this global ambition and moral renditions of it. Never before had the United States intervened in a European war. When Woodrow Wilson finally made a decision to intervene, the immediate justification was a series of German naval attacks on U.S. trading ships. Commerce on the high seas, he argued, was a global and inviolable right. But U.S. neutrality was merely formal. The sunken ships were hauling part of the U.S. surplus, war material and related goods, to European allies. And by 1917, U.S. financiers had lent the allies $2.3 billion. So
war is a big business.
War is a huge business. And a lot of people in the early wars made a lot of money from it. In more recent wars, a few people make a lot of money from it.
Mm-hmm. When you say a lot of people made money, you're talking about like the factories are going.
Yes.
And it's all
Mm-hmm. Production,
just
production for the war.
blue collar people benefit from for
Yes.
more.
Yes.
And okay.
In that regard, they certainly suffer because they're going out and dying. But
Okay.
yeah.
Right. Right.
But
There were a lot of mid-sized companies doing that.
yeah,
We're now.
and small companies, and in the earlier wars, and it was good for the economy. And I don't know if that justifies the war, but that is certainly, for some people, it does justify the war.
Okay, so it's sort of like it comes across like the way you present it, and it's like this machine that can't stop once you get it started. Like if war is what's good for business, you really can't stop war without a huge disruption to everything. And whoever's in the position of being the leader at that moment, you have a huge conflict of interest. You know, everyone is calling for peace, but then you have everyone calling for a strong economy, and economy, that's a big platform in elections. That's,
It is.
So when people are going to be elected, when a candidate is running for election, what policy wins? What platform wins?
Well, it depends. You made a statement that I don't quite agree with. You said people are calling for peace, but they want an economy, and that's stimulated by war. The people, and again, I'm talking about American citizens in general, that's what I've written about,
Yeah.
don't always want peace. In the Iraq War, which is another one that was manufactured, weapons of mass destruction that Saddam Hussein was accused of having, and he didn't. But the American public was totally behind that war.
Okay, so they're like, yeah, let's go get them.
Right.
They're behind it, but they bought into the
They
propaganda.
bought it, right. Now, 5 years into the war, American citizens were totally disillusioned with it, but that doesn't...
It's too late.
It's too... The war is going on, and all the death and destruction that goes with it. It's much easier for the U.S. to start wars than to end wars. So, same with the Vietnam War, which was opposed violently in the streets, in university campuses, everywhere, but it still dragged on for years. So... the American public seems to have this might makes right attitude, and there is an arrogance in the United States that they're the best at everything, and so if a country like Iraq, for example, is threatening them, then they're going to go and invade Iraq and destroy whatever's threatening them. Now, people were scared about weapons of mass destruction, and they were never found because they didn't exist.
And what you say in your book, they had to find the right boogeyman, basically.
Right.
That was the boogeyman
that was the one.
got people to get on board with it.
Mm-hmm.
The weapons of mass destruction.
Right. And Alan Greenspan, who was the head of the Federal Reserve for 20 years, appointed by a Republican, I believe, but he served under Republican and Democratic administrations. In his autobiography, he said, I'm troubled to know that people can't admit or can't discuss that the Iraq War was largely about oil.
And can people do that today, or is it still taboo?
There's more of it today, but...
Like, it's a different government. It's a Democratic government. Is it easier to blame it on... you can say it's oil because it's the Republicans that started
who did it. And there is some of that, certainly. But there's so much polarization in the United States today politically that it's hard to have a reasonable discussion about it.
Yeah. Now... You're a Mormon.
Yes.
Are there Mormons in different parts of the United States? Do they feel the same way, or is they're just as American as all the other Americans that get behind the wars and buy into the propaganda? Like,
what I've been told, and this is kind of my experience too, that Mormons who live in conservative areas of the country, the Mountain West and so on, tend to be more conservative. Those that live in the more liberal areas, the Northeast, for example, tend to be more liberal. So I'm probably among the most liberal of them, but there is, and probably most Mormons are more conservative. Mm-hmm. Excuse me, but there are liberal Mormons too.
It's got to be tough for any family in the United States that send their sons off to war, and then to if you look into from your view, if you look into it close enough, you're going to be real disappointed. You're going to be really. When you're disillusioned, and what's the sacrifice for, and all of that stuff that
definitely for anybody. Cindy Sheehan, she's a peace activist, she's currently running for governor of California, and her son Casey was killed in Iraq, and that's what kind of galvanized her, because he went over believing that this was the right thing to do and that the U.S. was threatened, and then he died for nothing. And
That's got to be crushing.
it's got to be absolutely devastating. I mean, I can't conceive of it. So she has turned that devastation into action, and she's I don't think she's going to be elected governor, but she doesn't have the right money people behind her. But she has made a statement. She, when George Bush was president, she camped out at down the road from his house in Texas. It was called Camp Casey, got a lot of publicity.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it's got to be the most devastating experience.
When I got to the end of the book, by the way, the book was, when I started, it was, I wasn't sure what to expect. But once I got into it, I found it I couldn't put it down.
Oh, good.
I couldn't
Glad
put
to
it
hear
down.
that.
Yeah. And the way you wrote it, it's very, it didn't bore me at all because, I have a short attention span. Most people do. Luckily, the chapters are short enough that they're like, this is an overview of what happened. You really can't go into, it would take volumes and volumes to properly give it a proper treatment,
Yes.
right? But that's not the point of the book. The point is to just bring to light these different things. And it was a real eye opener for me. When I got to the end of the book, though, I was quite disappointed.
Oh, why is that?
Because there's no, you offer no, it's sort of a cynical, like, well, I don't know if I have any answers for anybody, but anyways, that's the end of the book.
Right. Yeah.
Which is kind of, I was hoping for this is what Bob Fantina recommends for the American people to do to fix the problem. But there was none of that.
There was none of that, no.
And not that anyone really could. I don't know. But if I were to hold you to that, to give me an answer, what would it be?
Well, one of the things is right now there's a movement called World Beyond War.
Okay.
It's an international movement to bring an end to war. War was actually outlawed by the UN, and many nations, including the United States, signed on to it in the early part of the 20th century, and just been completely violated. But we, as a society, have come to believe that war is necessary at some times. But generations ago, people believed slavery was necessary. Generations ago, people believed that it was ridiculous for women to have the vote. Time has proven these things wrong. Slavery does still exist in some parts of the world, unfortunately, but most industrialized and first world countries have.
The rest of the world just doesn't accept that, though. They speak out again. They just say that's not acceptable, and there's if you're a leader in one of those countries, you're not liked.
Right. Yeah. Exactly.
There's a lot of pressure to end slavery or to end racism. There's still a lot of racism.
There is still a lot of racism, but it's outlawed. At least it's in the United States and Canada. Yeah. Everyone can eat at the same restaurants and that sort of thing. So, but these were things that were thought for years were necessary for one reason or another, or were just a part of society. And people think that way about war, and that can change. People can come to see that war is not necessary ever, and that there are alternatives to war. So the World Beyond War movement is something that is doing that.
Is there? Do you know the website for that?
I think it's just worldbeyondwar.org.
Okay. I'll check it out. I'll put a link on my
website
that'd be great,
as well.
Yeah. And because that sounds very hopeful.
Mm-hmm.
To some, they might say that that's naively hopeful because there is an argument, and I'm sure this is the thinking. Okay, everyone's been programmed to think this way, and maybe I am too. I don't know. Like I totally think that there's way better alternatives to war. But what if you're being attacked? What's the alternative? The alternative. I mean, my mind goes back to the scriptures and the anti-Nephi-Lehi's. I'm thinking of they had a very extreme alternative to war, and that was to just lay down and be slaughtered.
Right.
Right. That's one alternative, but I don't know if that's what most people would do.
Yeah, well, it's not going to happen overnight, certainly. But as you mentioned, with nations where there's still slavery, and they're basically ostracized. They don't get the same foreign aid from other countries. They don't have
the world looks at it and they say, we'll never hold the Olympics in your country.
Right.
They do stuff like that, right?
So countries that continue, you think of sometime in the future, countries that continue to maintain significant armies, that they are ostracized, they're not part of the world communities, they are not, they're just not accepted to the same degree. Now, obviously, other countries need to protect themselves against them until such point that, for example, nuclear weapons are all banned and so on. But it's a movement that has to happen. It has to start somewhere. And as I said, it's not going to be overnight, but it can be done.
If there's everybody buys into there's a little country being invaded. We got to go do something about it, and we're going to go invade the perpetrating country.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody gets on board with that. Well, what would be the alternative way to handle that? I mean, if it's a country that's not directly involved with our country,
mm-hmm.
okay, whether it be Canada or the United States, or if it's like, for example, Iraq invading Kuwait. Right?
Okay.
What would be a better alternative?
Well, we have to look back. We have to take a step back. So before Iraq invaded Kuwait, the U.S. ambassador to Iraq, she had talked to Saddam's people and said that she understood that they needed to do what was necessary to rebuild their economy. And the United States had no position on whether or not they were going to invade Kuwait. So then Iraq invaded Kuwait, and the next thing, the United States is invading Iraq. So couldn't that have been prevented earlier? If she had said to them, there are going to be big problems internationally if you invade Kuwait. You need to rebuild your economy. Let's see what other alternatives there are to doing that. So there's often war is led to by a variety of circumstances that are ongoing and that can be stopped at some point.
So that was just the last step in a whole series of steps.
Right.
That's almost too late at that point. It should have been
mm-hmm.
dealt with earlier.
Right. The reason that Iraq invaded Kuwait was because Iraq had grown, the population had grown significantly and very quickly, and Iraq was no longer getting credit from other countries to buy supplies that they need, and so they decided to annex Kuwait. And the American ambassador to Iraq said, the United States has no opinion on what you do with Kuwait. So
why did they say that?
Oh, who knows? Who knows?
Okay, now what would have been a tougher, like, looking back, one would say, well, we should be tougher and say, well, if you invade Kuwait, we're going to invade you. But then that's war again. That's the solution there is
mm-hmm.
might makes right. That threat would have been kind of against the ideal of we're beyond war.
But even before that point, when Iraq was having so many financial difficulties, their economy was in big trouble, their people were struggling to, the government wasn't able to pay its workers. Well, couldn't the UN have stepped in and offered economic assistance? Aren't there countries in the world that are rich enough to have made loans to Iraq? And I don't know specifically, but there were steps that Iraq could possibly have taken in the international community that would have repaired its economy without going to war. So there were alternatives, but those were not explored.
Okay. So in hindsight, we can see different alternatives. We can see with the advantage of hindsight.
Mm-hmm.
Learning from that, could you sort of give us a rundown on the situation right now with Russia and Ukraine,
mm-hmm.
and kind of lead us down a path of worst case scenario, and then lead us down another path of best case scenario on how to handle this whole conflict?
Okay, it is a very difficult one because Ukraine was previously part of Russia, as I understand it.
Okay.
And President Putin has said that releasing it was a mistake, and he's undoing that mistake. Now, there is...
Was this... I'm not familiar enough with the history. Was this pre-fall of USSR, or was this after the fall of USSR?
No, I understand it's pre-fall of USSR, I think.
Okay, so it's part of Russia, and then USSR breaks up, and then Ukraine is separated at that point from Russia, or at least before that point?
Yeah, before or at that point. And okay. I'm not 100%, I'm not as familiar with this as I might be.
Okay.
But anyway, the first thing that happened was the United States started putting sanctions against Russia. And
like just recently because of
because of this.
Because we don't agree with what you're doing.
Right.
You're doing exactly what Iraq was doing with Kuwait, and we're not allowing you to do that.
Yeah.
Okay.
But one might say that they're doing exactly what the United States did with Iraq. But that's another
okay.
story.
Right.
So, but
or what the United States did with Texas, right? Or
Exactly. Yeah.
you go back far enough.
Yeah. Oh,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay.
There are countless examples. So, but it's sanctions against Iraq.
Okay. So this
or
is
against Russia.
this is sanctions are a pre-war measure. Like you try to get them to comply through
Right.
sanctions before you escalate. Is that the
That's
idea?
one of the steps. But sanctions generally only hurt the people in the country. They don't hurt the government at all. So there's not a lot of impact in doing that unless the people are going to rise up against the government.
And usually the other government has enough resolve to say, well, your sanctions, we're
Right.
still going to do what we're going to do.
Right.
And
Yeah.
so sanctions don't do anything other than hurt the people of that country.
So the United Nations, I don't know what steps the United Nations has taken as yet, but the United Nations can see first, do the people of Ukraine want to be part of Russia again, or they want to be independent? What is their goal? I don't know what that is.
And well, that's debatable because they had a referendum, and you get you get people voting in the referendum saying, yeah, we want to be part of the country, and then you have others that say, well, something's rigged here, and we're not recognizing that referendum, and so there's a whole debate on whether whether the election is fair, or the voting is fair, and all that stuff. So that's really, really tricky.
That is tricky.
But in an ideal world where if there was a true, fair, proper referendum, and they voted one way or another, is that the right way to handle it? Do you think?
Well, that might be one alternative. And also, even in a less than perfect world, there are usually international observers to elections who sometimes say if this election was fair, or they say this was a circus. And so there are ways of monitoring elections to make that evaluation.
Right. So if the elections are put on by a sponsoring government,
right,
that's something. There's a conflict there, right? And,
yeah. But if it appears if the various international observers who are there for that reason say this seemed to be a fair election, some people may disagree with the outcome of it, but if it was a fair election, it was a fair election. So that might be one thing.
Okay.
But I think a larger question is, what is the United States' role in interfering in a dispute between Russia and the Ukraine?
Exactly. That's take us down the worst case scenario.
Well,
what's the worst thing that could happen out of this, and take it as far as history has taught us?
Well, the U.S. could invade invade the Ukraine, and which will, of course, destroy relations with Russia, which have been good for all these years. Russia has allies, the U.S. has allies that'll further polarize those. If Iraq and Afghanistan can be used as a model, it will devastate the Ukraine. It will kill hundreds of thousands of people, cause untold suffering, and I think it'd be better off let them become part of Russia.
Okay.
But the best case, if they just become part of Russia, the United States probably will not tolerate that, and there will be some kind of action.
Is it because they view it as Russia being too aggressive, or is it more like, or is there some other American interest going on here?
I'm not aware of any other American interest except that putting Russia in this place that it can't just take over another country. Now, it's okay for the U.S. to take over another country. But,
right.
Yeah.
Now, this isn't even communism anymore. Like this is
no.
It's not about that. It used to be about that.
It used to be about communism, but now it's just the rights of the people of the Ukraine to democratic elections and say in their destiny and in their country. So now,
would it be kind of and similar? Like an analogy would be if Quebec has a referendum and decides to separate from Canada, the U.S. invading for because of that. Like,
well,
do you think is that kind of silly?
It is. Well, in a sense, it's kind of silly, but and it's a little different because I think if Canada decided to take Alaska, but if Canada decided to break up into Quebec and the rest of Canada,
yeah,
I don't think the United States would care. Excuse me, but if there was some commercial advantage and Quebec decided to break away and Canada opposed it, then the United States would say,
Well, that's conceivable, right?
Mhm.
I mean, if separatists want to separate, and they separate, and the rest of Canada says we don't want you to separate, and the separatists say, well, too bad, we're
Mhm.
separate.
Mhm.
There's a conflict there,
Mhm.
and then the U.S. may see an advantage and take advantage, like see
It-
an opportunity and take advantage of it.
yes, if the U.S. has some commercial or strategic interest in Quebec, they can say that the people of Quebec have every right to self-determination, and that if they want to succeed from or declare their independence from Canada, they should be able to.
And declare war
And
on Canada.
well, first sanctions certainly, and yeah,
Yeah,
who knows?
start with
Yeah.
sanctions, okay.
Yeah.
That was the whole premise of that movie Canadian Bacon, right?
Yes, it was. Yeah. Yes.
Let's invade Canada.
Right. Yeah.
See, it's funny because it's ridiculous, but it's so. The ridiculousness is the sad thing when it happens.
Yeah, and it plays out on the world stage, and no one thinks it's ridiculous.
Yeah.
It's
So take us through just really, really briefly, because you mentioned so many examples, like
Mhm.
more than I even realized. What are all the countries that you can name a few that you name in the book that the U.S. has invaded and taken over?
oh
Can you do it by memory, or you can look at your book?
yeah,
It's fine.
because there've been
You list it, and I
many.
couldn't believe how
Yeah.
long that list was.
I think it's in my summary.
Yeah, it's near the back.
Yeah,
You
okay.
it's
So
like,
here's the list.
and I think you go in chronological order too,
Yeah.
right?
So this is quoting from the book.
And it's funny because some countries are in there more than once.
Right, yeah. The following is a partial list of countries whose governments suffered the displeasure of the U.S. since the start of the Cold War, which is late 50s, mid 50s. For each of these nations, the U.S. actively overthrew their government during a military invasion, such as Iraq in 2003, was covertly involved in their overthrow, or is currently attempting their overthrow. All right, here's the list. Do you want the years too, or just the...
Yeah.
Okay. Syria, 1949. Iran, 1953. Guatemala, 54. Tibet, 55. Indonesia, 58. Cuba, 59. Democratic Republic of Congo, 1960 through 1965. South Vietnam, 1963. Brazil, 64. Ghana, 66. Chile, 70 through 73. Afghanistan, 1979 through 1989. Turkey, 1980. Poland, 80 and 81. Nicaragua, 81 through 90. Cambodia, 1980. Angola, the 1980s. Philippines, 1986. Iraq, 1992 through 1996. Venezuela, 2002. The Palestinian Authority, 2006 to the present. Somalia, 2006 to 2007. Iran, 2005 to the present. Libya, 2011. Syria, 2012.
I had no clue. I mean, most of those countries, I had no clue the U.S. had anything to do
Mhm.
with or had any interest in.
It's amazing.
Like the Congo,
Mhm.
Indonesia. What does the U.S. have any interest in those areas? That's
Sometimes it's business, commercial interests.
my goodness. I'm a little worried here. Like we live in, I'm probably biased, but I think we live in the absolute best country in the world. We have, probably the second greatest land mass
Mhm.
in our borders. We're free, like you said. There's more equality. You know, if you're born in poverty, you know, you still have running water. You still have,
Mhm.
you can still drive to work. I mean,
Mhm.
that's poverty in this country. You know,
Right.
poverty in other countries it's a very different picture, right? And our vast resources. We have the greatest amount of fresh water, I believe, in the world. There's the oils, the oil sands, and all of the great resources, all the mining that Canada has. And yet we have a very small population and a very, very small military to defend ourselves. How come the U.S. has not invaded Canada yet?
Well, it did, of course, in
I should
1812.
That's
yeah.
true. That's true.
Yeah.
But how did we manage to keep them at bay? How did we manage to hold our ground? We're so tiny and small, and yet we have these vast, valuable resources with such a small military to defend it. How's it possible?
It's a very good question. And I think the only answer that I can think of is that the Canada has been sufficiently agreeable to the United States that the United States has felt the need to take it.
So we've always just bowed down to their interests, basically?
I think, basically, yeah. Pretty much. When has the United States really... Well, the United States did defy Canada during the 60s and 70s when deserters and draft dodgers were welcomed into Canada, which is a shining star in Canada's history, I think.
Okay. How did the U.S. react to that, and were we scared by the reaction?
I think at that time, the war in Vietnam was going so horribly. There was international outrage and opposition to it that the United States had more important things to worry about than Canada accepting draft dodgers.
Okay, so
That could be a
the
rationalization. I don't know.
The cards were probably right at that time.
Yeah.
But if we had a real problem with U.S. policy and we decided to put sanctions on them, for example, if we said we're no longer providing oil to you, what would happen?
Oh, nothing good. Yeah, I just said Canada has a small military. The U.S. has a huge military. The U.S. spends on its military what the next 10 largest countries spend on their military combined. So it's a phenomenal amount to spend on the military.
Yeah. I'm just Canadian, and it's almost as good as being American, in terms of what I mean by that is, I grew up in Fort Erie, which is a border town to Buffalo, New York, and so I mean we grew up with Buffalo television stations. We'd go over the Peace Bridge and just buy gas over there. We'd buy Canadian gas over in Buffalo, way cheaper than we could in Canada, right? And go shopping, do our grocery shopping over there. We were very friendly with them, and in our minds, we were just as American as Americans were, right? Just culturally and all that stuff, right?
Yes.
But I never grew up in Vietnam. I never grew up in the Congo or in Venezuela or in Cuba. I didn't grow up in any of those countries where there's the big bad American, like very, very anti-American sentiments. They hate Americans. And I grew up thinking, why do they hate Americans? Oh, they must hate freedom and democracy. That's sort of what that's the explanation, right? And now from your book, I'm starting to understand a little more why people hate Americans so much.
Well, and considering today, American drones are killing people in Yemen, if I pronounced that correctly. And what they will do is target somebody, a suspected terrorist, and kill dozens of other people while they're killing that person. So there was a gentleman who testified before Congress recently, and he said he had spent his high school years in the United States, and his neighbors back in Yemen had a good impression of the United States from him. And now they hate the United States because he talked about one suspected terrorist. He said everyone knew where he was. If the U.S. wanted him, they could have come and said, where is this person? They said, oh, he's over there in that house, whatever. But instead they sent drones, killed I don't know how many innocent people, and killed this person too, who may or may not have been innocent. Who knows? He had no trial. He had no charge. And so that is inspiring more and more hatred against the United States. But as you said, I listed that list of countries who all have reasons for hating the United States because of what the United States has done to them.
It's interesting how you said they were killing a terrorist.
Suspected terrorist.
And he may well have been a terrorist, but you listed the statistics on the likelihood of being killed by a terrorist. You're more likely to die of a bee sting in the United States than being killed by a terrorist, which is, the amount of money that is spent on fighting terrorism is much more than we do to prevent bee stings.
Right.
It's quite an eye opener. So, okay, I wanted to ask you about. There's a big part in your book that talks a lot about the state of Israel and how that whole country came about.
Yes,
and what had happened. Give us a rundown on what it is today and what people think it is today and what it actually is. What's going on? Okay,
the U.S. will tell you that that Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East, and that it's a place of freedom, and that the country has to defend itself against other countries in the area that want to destroy Israel. Israel was created by the ethnic cleansing of initially 750,000 Palestinians who were driven from their homes with no compensation. They're just told to leave. Many of them, it's generational in refugee camps because they can't go back to their homes. So the United States gives Israel more foreign aid than it gives to any other country, and has for many years. Israel gets about $9 million a day for its military from the United States. Now, Palestine, which is occupied by Israel, It's separated into the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. The Gaza Strip is all its borders are controlled by Israel, land, sea, and air, in violation of countless international laws. The UN has issued more resolutions criticizing or condemning Israel than all the other countries put together. The United States routinely vetoes some of them, but even those that have passed, it's still more than all the other countries put together.
Mm-hmm.
In the West Bank, Israel has checkpoints. People have to go, if they might want to go to a location that's 2 blocks away, but they have to go miles and miles to get there because of the checkpoints, which are arbitrarily closed.
Wait, a checkpoint, what is that? Is that just for security?
Well, they say it's for security, but it's internal to the West Bank, which is Palestine. It's not just the border between Palestine and Israel. So there are countless checkpoints within the West Bank itself.
This is, Palestinian territory, but Israelis are in there controlling...
Right, they occupy it. They control every aspect of it.
What's the fear? What are they saying is the fear? Like if they don't have a checkpoint, what's wrong with not having a checkpoint?
Well, they say it's all for security because occasionally Palestinians are able to cobble together sufficient supplies to send a bottle rocket into Israel. Now, the interesting thing is that the percentage of Israelis that have been killed by Palestinians is next to nothing compared to the number of Palestinians that have been killed. And also when the Palestinians will send a couple of bottle rockets and then Israel will carpet bomb Gaza with no regard for children or anything else. So unemployment is very high in Palestine. What's imported and exported is closely monitored by Israel. Farmers, in order to farm their own land, say if a farmer wants to plant seeds in his own land, he or she has to get permission from Israel, get a permit to do it. And the permit may be at a time it's too early or too late for planting. But if they are able to plant, then they have to harvest, they have to get permission to harvest, and often the date that they're told they can't harvest is after the crops have spoiled.
Wait. Why do they have to control that? That a farmer just farms, like what on the farmer's time schedule, which is really the nature's time schedule. Like why would they control that? Why can't you plant a seed? Why can't you harvest on your own schedule?
It's all terrorism because although Israel was formed in 47-48 by the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian people, Israel continues to build settlements, again in violation of international law, because it is against international law to move the occupying population into the occupied territory on a permanent basis. But they want to take the land and intimidate farmers to leave, to go somewhere else, to leave the country.
This is a nuisance factor. They're not doing it for any agricultural reason. It's really, it's just to say,
nuisance, yeah.
If you're going to live here, you're going to live by our rules. And
Yeah.
if you don't like them, you got to go.
Yeah,
and that's sort of what it is.
And exactly what it is. And in checkpoints, a woman could be on her way to give birth, and she's to a checkpoint, and she may have to wait hours to get through. At least 70 babies have died in the last couple of years because they've been born at checkpoints and have needed medical treatment, but they can't get through the checkpoint to get it.
So this is Israel doing this, but this is United States enabling Israel to do this.
Of course, at $9 million a day is...
So, okay, this isn't the United States telling them to do this, right? This is just them out of their own fears and their own sense of needing to control. They've chosen to do this, and the United States just backs them up, sort of whatever they choose to do, the United States backs them up.
Yes, and it's not due to fear, it's due to wanting more land. They want all of Palestine, and that's not what the initial UN resolution allowed.
Why is it a sense of entitlement, or is it...
It's absolute sense of entitlement.
Like, this is, does it go right down to, I guess, theological reasons? I mean,
yeah.
They're the chosen people.
And this is their land, and they want it, regardless of...
they got biblical precedent. I mean, there's all kinds of reasons to... Like, is that really what it is?
That's what it comes down to. That's what the Zionist philosophy is that it's their land, it's always been their land, and now they want it back. But
that's where the Bible is pretty controversial in that sense, because it's right in the Bible, right? And a lot of people don't know what to make of those chapters, right?
Yeah, there are difficult chapters, but I look at the reality of the situation, which is horrific suffering is being perpetrated on innocent people, and this is not something that anyone can say Heavenly Father is pleased with. So
I would contend that I don't know. I might get in trouble for saying this, but I don't know. Written in the record, I don't know if Heavenly Father was pleased with that either. I believe in the whole challenge and be challenged by Scripture philosophy.
Yeah.
Some things in the Bible are, I think, it's like history is written by the victors, right?
True.
And much of it is inspired.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of things that maybe could have been done differently. Did they have to kill? Did they have to kill every man and not and take the women and children and make them slaves and all that stuff? Did they have to do that?
Yeah, and
I don't know.
We believe in the Bible as far as it's translated correctly, and who knows? But
I'm sure that part's translated correctly. I think that just there's a lot of scholarly debate about that. Anyways, that's a whole different topic. But there's Anyways, but it's there. It's in the canon of all Jews and all Christians. It's right there, and it's funny because I was just speaking to Michael Clifton about interfaith stuff.
Yeah,
and part of the criticisms that Christians have of Islam is the violence in their scriptures and all that stuff. Well, of course,
yeah, there's plenty in our scriptures.
Yeah. But what about really like practicing? I don't know. I'm not Jewish. I don't have a Jewish mindset, but surely they have. I don't know. The idea of Zion is probably very different than what Mormons' idea of Zion is, right?
It's very different, yeah.
I was going to actually talk to you about that. Because growing up Mormon, my idea of Zion is one thing, and I remember talking to somebody. I think I was talking to he was a Christian who had converted from Judaism. And I told him about Zion, and I didn't realize at the time that we mean totally different things.
Right. Yeah.
The building up of Zion and all that stuff, and we're supposed to be a Zion people,
right.
and I'm thinking, that's great of the Israel to whatever, but I didn't realize that the Zionist movement is a very violent, can be a very violent one, and I don't mean to be. I don't mean this podcast is not a political podcast at all. I'm not trying to be at all.
Right.
I'm not making any political position on anything. But I'm just becoming more aware of what things mean, and
that's important.
What is it about Israel that makes the United States so supportive?
Well, what's about it is the American Israel Political Affairs Committee, which is not a political action committee, but it is able to funnel millions of dollars into the re-election campaigns of American politicians. And they rely on that to be elected. And so violations of Palestine's borders, violations of human rights, they're all overlooked because the American AIPAC is called is so powerful.
What do you think of if there? We're for the alternative to war. The Israelis have a very strong arm militarily, but if they back down, will that be taken advantage of? Will the other states? Because they're very. My understanding is that they're very hated, as they always have been throughout all history. They're smack dab in the middle of enemy states.
That's
right?
true.
And right in Egypt and Syria and all, like just throughout all of time, throughout all of biblical history. I always thought, well, if God wanted to deliver his people, why didn't he just take them over on a boat to Australia.
Right.
They could worship.
Right.
They could worship Yahweh all they wanted to without anybody bothering them.
Yeah.
Why place them smack dab in the middle of all of the enemy
Mhm.
nations? And not much has changed. And so,
Not much has changed.
what do you think?
Well, first of all, Israel isn't doing anything to endear itself to its neighbors. The horrific oppression of Arab peoples in Palestine is not going to win them points in Egypt, certainly. So freedom for Palestine doesn't mean the end of Israel. Most people support a two-state solution.
Most Palestinians support that.
I don't know if most Palestinians do, but the international community.
Mm-hmm.
I think most Palestinians would be satisfied with it at this point, because at least they would have a country, not the country that was taken from them in the 1940s, but they would still have a country where they could live in freedom and autonomy and be able to trade with the world community and that sort of thing, which they are forbidden from doing now. So, as I said, Israel is very powerful militarily because the United States gives it so much money. The United States gives Palestine no money for military aid. So that gives you an idea of the inequality that goes on there.
And this is all lobbyists influencing that.
It's lobbyist influence. In fact, when Palestine was elevated to non-voting member state in the UN a little over a year ago, about a year and a half ago, the U.S. withdrew some of the funding, some of the humanitarian funding that it sends to Palestine. So anything that Palestine does to assert itself as a nation, and to try to establish its own democratic country, the United States opposes because of AIPAC.
That's amazing.
It is amazing, and it's not as it should be at all.
No.
And that's just one example of lobby's power over the U.S. Congress.
And one of the questions I wanted to ask as well was, like, whoever is in power, are they just in a no-win situation? Even if they wanted to do the right thing, could they not, just because of it's sort of like once the machine is on once the machine's rolling, you can't stop it. Like, how does one stop it? How does one get in there and make a change?
Well, I think things can change. For example, a couple of years ago, in the Security Council in the UN proposed criticizing Israel over continued settlement building, and all of the states in Security Council voted yes, except the United States, which vetoed it. And the ambassador to the UN said, "We disagree with Israelis' continued settlement building, but don't think this is the right forum to discuss it." Well, why couldn't they just voted yes? So a little thing like that can be done.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't think the person in power, certainly there's a lot of opposition, and the polarization that I mentioned before is extreme in the United States now between conservatives and liberals. But there's still things that people in power can do if they choose to do it.